Good morning, afternoon, everyone. Today, we're honored to have Dr. Agnes Kaposi, who's with us today. Her story of both survival of the Holocaust, I should say to start, she's Hungarian. She survived the Hungarian Holocaust, or the Holocaust in Hungary through the Second World War, and then lived in Hungary after the war and fled, not to take too much of the story. Hungary in 1956, after the Hungarian Revolution, which many of you would have learned about at GCSE, became dangerous for her and her family, coming indirectly, anyway, to England in 1957. Her story is unbelievable. Her book, Yellow Star, Red Star, is a highly recommended read, and we have several copies in our library, and I hope many of you will pick it up afterwards. She's also an acclaimed scholar, a fellow of the Royal Academy of Engineering, which, for a woman at the time, is an incredible achievement, considering the, how do I say it, the paternalism or the sort of male-dominated society that she broke barriers through in England. I'm seemingly less articulate than I normally am today, but forgive me. I don't want to take any of her thunder. The story you're going to hear is truly riveting. There'll be some time for questions at the end, but without further ado, I turn the floor over to Dr. Kaposi.
Thank you. Can you hear me well? Very good. The title of the pages over there, it already has a mistake in it. It is the 8th of July today, and the date is wrong. I apologize. It was meant to be the 21st and hasn't been corrected. And also, it is not quite right, because it's not only a story of the Hungarian Holocaust, it's a little bit more than that. I also should like to go back to the introduction. I was born in Hungary, but I am not Hungarian. I was told, ever since I can remember back, by the Hungarians that no Jew is Hungarian. We didn't belong. And since they told me that I didn't belong to them, why should I claim to belong to them now? So I'm a Hungarian-born Briton and an engineer. Those letters after my name, the FRNG is the important bit. Your teacher mentioned already. I am, in fact, a fellow of the Royal Academy of Engineering and the most senior woman fellow. It's the institution for the top of the engineering profession. You are elected into it, it's an honor. And in the first 20 years of its existence, they found 4 women in the first 20 years worthy of being elected into the fellowship of the Royal Academy of Engineering, which says something about engineering and Britain attitudes. I am now the most senior woman fellow because the first 2 who were elected before me are already dead. I'm still just about alive, so I'm the most senior fellow of the Royal Academy of Engineering. I have an engineering degree from Hungary and a PhD from Britain, and all of those are the letters after my name. Introduction is finished. If we could have the next slide, and shout if you don't see it when I say next slide. That's the tiny country of Hungary. It wasn't quite so tiny. Those of you who studied the history of the First World War will know that the end of the First World War amounted to the curtailment of the territories of Hungary. There's a lot to be said about that. They are considering this now rump of the beautiful country, and it's all the fault of the Jews. So they had to do something about it quite rapidly after the First World War. Hungary distinguished itself by being the first European country to establish a restrictive law against the Jews in 1920. At that time, people didn't even hear the name of Hitler. Hungary was a tailblazer then, and is a tailblazer currently of right-wing populism in Europe. The next slide will remind you of a number of dates and facts. I just picked a few of the key dates here for consideration and for comparison. The conclusion was 6 million Jews murdered in Europe. The next slide shows what happened in Hungary in that sequence of times. As I already said, the 1920 First World War, law against the Jews was just one of 42 in course of the Nazi times. Most of the laws were in fact even before the outbreak of the Second World War. In 1933, just about the time when Hitler came to power in Germany, right-wing Prime Minister Goebbels came to power, and he was more Hitler than Hitler. To him is attached the coining of the term Axis, the Axis powers of the Second World War. In 1940, Hungary joined the war on Hitler's side, and that set the Hungarian Holocaust to be on a different path to any of the other countries of Europe, because Hungary was fighting the war on the same side as Hitler, instead of being a victim of the war, as for example Poland or France or other European countries were. There was a great problem with this, because the Hungarian army was on the Eastern Front in the Ukraine, fighting the Soviets, and what to do with the Jews. The Jews by then had been oppressed, deprived of their civil rights. Shall we put them into the army, in their uniforms, and give them armory, and what if they turn against us and side with the Soviets instead? Or shall we leave them behind and let them be in the nice home of what is still left of their homes, while the non-Jews of Hungary are fighting the war against the Red Army? They had a big problem what to do with the young men, and they solved the problem easily. They sent the Jews without arms, without uniforms, to the Ukrainian front, and they added some instructions, or at least requirements, that no Jew, or as few as possible, should come back from the war. There were easy ways to do this, for example, to form tight formations of Jews and march across a minefield, and that got rid of both the mines and the Jews. 70,000 Jewish men were killed during that time, including most of the young men in our family. In 1944, on the slide comes the next important number. 437,000 Jews were sent from the Hungarian provinces to Auschwitz. And if any of you have been to Auschwitz or will go, you will see that there was a special ramp needed to be built in the summer of 1944 to accommodate this enormous influx of Hungarian Jews. I'll mention this in a moment. Very few survivors. They didn't finish off the job. There were nearly 200,000 Jews still left in Budapest when the provinces had already been cleared of Jews, and about half of them survived. But 90,000 nevertheless were killed in various ways, death marched, they were shot into the Blue Danube or other ways. The survivors were ultimately liberated by the Soviet army in 1945. If you do the sums of those figures, it will amount to, and this is approximate, 600,000 Jews killed in, Hungarian Jews killed in the Second World War, which is 10% of the entire victimhood of European Jewry. And if you consider Hungary to be an almost insignificantly tiny country with a population less than the size of London. It is quite an achievement on the side of the journalist. Now, next slide. Who should tell you about it all? There are people, your teachers, who would be able to give you an authoritative story on the basis of the distilled history. Because between that time and this time, historians will have researched, they have amassed information, but all of this benefited the existing political history, which is the history of the nations and the country and Europe as a whole. It benefited from the personal histories of people like me who were there and who experienced some of those events, and out of those assembled the political history which you are learning. The next slide will show you my book, and my book is a combination of witness testimony and historians' commentary. I was, when I was writing this book, and it took me 10 years of diligent research trying to look at the background. But I'm not a historian, I'm only an engineer. Nevertheless, I tried to research and I kept on looking for collaboration with a historian. And about 6 months before the book appeared, I actually found a Holocaust historian, a non-Jewish young Hungarian, half my age, less than half my age, and his commentary runs alongside the book. So you get, in the case of this book, 2 for the price of 1, and any income from it goes, in any case, to March of the Living or other charities. Well, go back to personal history now very rapidly. The next slide shows me and Hitler. I was born 3 months before Hitler came to power. The next slide gives you some memories of preschool me. I lost contact with my parents. My father, in fact, was one of those who was first persecuted by the right-wing government for being a socialist, only later on for being a Jew. He was blacklisted, he had to flee practically the city of my birth, went to the capital hoping to get a job, he didn't. I was left behind with Granny. Must have been a shock because I acquired a stammer and it took many years for me to get rid of the stammer, and that was my first, if you like, experience as a victim of what happened in my beautiful native land. Finally, my mother managed to get a job. My father was unemployed throughout. A brilliant man, a mathematician and a classicist. He was unemployed through most of my childhood. We lived behind a little room behind my mother's little shop. My mother was working all the time. I hardly had any knowledge of my mother. I had no children to play with because Jewish children were few or non-existent in our district, and I wasn't allowed to play with the non-Jewish children. This is preschool. I did have great opportunity to play with my father and all my uncles. My uncles were a doctor, a lawyer, a civil engineer, a banker, all of them unemployed. Why? Because of some of those anti-Jewish laws I have already mentioned. They had no children of their own. I was the only child of the family, so I had playmates. I came across pictures on the walls. This is preschool memory. Next slide, please. And I gave you only a few examples here. And us not being a religious family, we were socialists. I wanted to know, and I asked my father, who are these Jews we were to kill? Who are these ugly Jews? Who are the ugly Jews who are also rich, as the middle poster shows you, where the rest of the Hungarian population is starving? And my father said, we are those Jews. So I said, preschool me, but we don't look like this. We haven't got big noses. We are not rich. And my father said, yeah, nevertheless, we are those Jews. Why should we be killed? Why do they hate us? And that's when my father had to say, I'm afraid I can't tell you that, because I don't know. That is all preschool. The next slide gives you a picture of some of my uncles I mentioned to you before. The one on the left is actually an artist, I didn't mention him. The others are all professionals, all unemployed, as I told you, because they were Jews. I started school on the next slide, it will show you, in 1939, only a few days after the war broke out. I really picked my dates carefully, didn't I? I went to junior school in that building at the bottom. The junior entry was the far door. The senior entry was the nearer door on your picture. I did very well at school, I always did. And so I expected that when we finished the junior school, me as the top of the class, I would just sail into the senior school, but it didn't happen. By 1943-44 academic year, the school was, the senior school was declared a purely Aryan institution. Aryan, do you know the word? Yeah, you do. Well, I learned it, and I couldn't go into it. But matters got heated up rather more. In 1944, the next slide shows you, in March, April, and early May, first the German army came to occupy Hungary. An interesting historical fact, ask your teacher about it, how it is that Germany came to occupy its allied Hungary. The picture on the top is a famous one. These are the dangerous Jews who had to be distinguished by branding them with a yellow star. I have a story about the yellow star in that book. I could tell you it there is time. The bottom picture shows the Jews building their own wall, the ghetto walls. It reminds you of what happened in Poland, where the Jews were digging those graves into which they were themselves shot. Well, the next slide gives you a brief discussion of 56 days. This is the greatest achievement of the Nazi regime, because in 56 days they managed to murder 437,000 Jews in Auschwitz. I already mentioned this to you. And on the 9th of July, Adolf Eichmann could proudly declare to Hitler that Hungary's provinces were Judenrein. Do you know the word? Rhine is clean. Judenrein, clean of Jews. As I mentioned already, Budapest's Jews couldn't be gotten rid of for various interesting reasons historians could explain and analyze. If you come across any of my generation of their descendants, Hungarian Jews, they are Budapest Jews, because only 15,000 Jews of the provinces remained alive. 437,000 had been killed. I am one of the 15,000, and the next slide is the one about our journey. That is a picture I took of the sort of wagons in which we traveled. There were 87 of us. 4 days and 5 nights in the summer, without water, without food, and without sanitation. The picture on the right is an artist's impression of what it was like. It is quite consistent with what I remember. The map is interesting because the 15,000, out of them, about 12,000 were directly taken to Vienna. Interesting story. Why? They were deported to the districts of Vienna, and there was one train, only one, which was heading for Auschwitz, crossed the border, drawn in red, and then turned around. I remember that our train turned around and didn't go to Auschwitz, went instead to Vienna. That's why I'm here. I actually met recently a lady whose sister, also called Agnes, was also born in 1932, like me, and she went on the train 2 days after, from my the native city to Auschwitz, and she's there. So, it's just one of those things. The next slide shows you some pictures of what happened next. We were near Vienna, slave laborers. Some people say, ask me, how many hours did we work? Well, we didn't have a watch, but we worked from before sunup to past sundown. First in agriculture, then in an armament factory, and last of all, clearing bomb damage in the beautiful city of Vienna. Anybody that had been to Vienna, you had been to some of the tourist attractions, beautiful museums, opera house. I had been there, and that is what it looked like when I was there. I was clearing the bomb damage. Well, the Soviet army liberated us. The experience is different from what you hear of the British or the American armies liberating Western Europe camps. I could tell you some stories about what it was like, not only to be liberated by the Soviet army, but also crossing lines of the Soviet army while we were trying to head back home to Hungary. It took us a month. The next picture shows you it's a Google map picture, and it tells you how many hours it would take on foot. Well, it took us a month. We were skeletons, the likes of which you have seen many times. Ours was a complete family, including 2 toddlers. They survived, only just, but they had to be carried. We were starved, that's what it was like. Why did we go back to Hungary, having been treated there as we were? Well, because we wanted to meet up with our men who had been taken into the army, the Jewish battalions of the army. We didn't know they were all dead. When we arrived, instead of the beautiful pictures of Budapest that you would find, because it's truly a beautiful city, and there are tourist information available inviting you to have holidays in Hungary, well, that's the picture on the top right. The bottom right is what it actually looked like. The same bridge down, corpses on the streets, starvation. It was not that easy. The next slide shows what happened in 1946. In history, there has never been, and I hope there never will be, inflation like the one that happened in Hungary. Those banknotes are, in fact, it's a photograph I took of some of the banknotes on my shelves. The picture on the right is a man sweeping them up on the streets, because by the time they were printed and handed out, they were worth less than the paper they were written on. What I did not realize was that in 1946 there were still pogroms happening in Hungary. I did not realize this until relatively recently. The history of the Holocaust and the Hungarian Holocaust particularly is so deep, you never stop learning. I talked to my historian, fellow writer of that book, and I said, look here, I just read about the pogrom in the vicinity of my native city, Debrecen, in 1946. And he said, are you surprised? And I said, well, this had never been written up anywhere. He said, well, why should that have been written up? There were pogroms everywhere. We did not know. The next slide is just a symbolic representation of the Stalinist era of 1947 to 55. We are no longer in the Holocaust area, so this is the extra you are getting in my story. These are just symbols. In a communist regime, the individual amounts to nothing. There are no decisions. You ask a question, any question. Where did you live? Where the state decided to. Where did you go to university? Where the state sent you. Where did you start working? Where they told you to go? What did you eat? What was given to you? It was a crippling regime where your very soul was compromised. What did you see in the museums? What film did you see in this? What music did you listen to? What the state decided? Anyhow, in 1956 came the revolution. There are two pictures in the middle, which should be seen on the next slide. Are you seeing it? Yeah. The statue in the middle is that of Stalin, and the head of the thing is just underneath it, after it had been beaten into pieces by the enraged mob. It was, in fact, a sad story. The Hungarian Revolution. It started beautifully, and I think in my book I even include a 16-point manifesto of what they wanted. They wanted democracy and freedom, and rid of the Soviet yoke. And instead, after a couple of days, it turned into a rampage, into vindictive killing of the perpetrators and, of course, some of the Jews. Whatever happened in Hungary always was the fault of the Jews. Well, my husband and I escaped, and the next slide has great symbolic significance. We are nearly at the end. We started from the right-hand side of the map, the east bit, from the hell of the revolution and the post-revolution oppression, and we fetched up in beautiful Cambridge, and there is the picture to represent it for you. We came not as refugees, but as working people. So more than any of you, I have been of use to this country, because from the very moment I set foot in it, I was a taxpayer, and still am. Whereas some of you, all of you, for a good part of your life are not yet taxpayers. Well, I have been a taxpayer, and there is my labor permit for you to investigate. I worked here in an electronics company in Cambridge. That was my first job in Britain. The next slide is almost the last. That is the story of my life. Soon we arrived, we had our first daughter, and there is me feeding her. I got a PhD a little bit later. The picture on the right, on the top, appears as though I am being the underling and the man is the boss. It's actually the other way around. I was the boss, but I never looked it. I was smaller than he, I had a thinner voice than he had, and I didn't have the physical presence that would make me a boss. I was the boss nevertheless. I worked in the telephone and the computer industries, and I wrote several books, apart from the one which you have got there. And the last slide that I should like to show you is my greatest achievement, is the quintet of my grandchildren, of whom I am extremely proud, and it's quite a thought. None of them would be here, except for that train changing direction. Isn't that an interesting thought? Well, thank you very much for listening to me, and I should like to have comments as well as questions, please.
If I may begin with a couple of questions, then we'll turn it over to the floor. Teaching the Holocaust as I do, I often ask people why they think it occurred, and you will get very typically an explanation saying something to the effect of, it's because of the Nazis and the influence of Hitler, that they terrorized people to do these horrible things. And I've asked Hungarians why the Holocaust happened. And very often they'll point fingers and say, it was Eichmann who came into our country and he pushed it on us. We protected our Jews. We didn't have as bad, the Hungarian Jews were safer in Hungary than they were elsewhere. It's a very typical response. How would you respond to someone who offered you that answer to the question?
And if you believe that, you believe anything. It's very interesting to compare the two tyrannical regimes. I shall answer your question, coming from it in the Jewish way. If you compare the two tyrannical regimes, of my experience, the right-wing Nazi one with the communist one later, one of the major differences between the two is the attitude of the people themselves. In the case of the right-wing Nazi regimes, well, first of all, there was a limited target. It was the Jews and the Gypsies and so on who were targeted, and not the population at large. But the population was for it. They were enthusiastic. It's not that there were no righteous people. I could list at least 5 nice people in my personal experience who were not in favor of, at least 5. But the majority of the population was with the regime. They had a lot to benefit by it anyway. When the Jews were chased out of their homes or their businesses were shut down, or when gifted young men like my uncles were not allowed to take jobs, then there were more jobs, more homes, more businesses available for the rest of the population. They materially benefited by the regime in the case of the Nazi times, but they were also that way inclined. There is something, there's a very beautiful, wonderful poet, Hungarian poet, not Jewish, and Adi, A-D-Y is the name, who writes after the First World War about the contamination of the Hungarian soul by anti-Semitism. There is something inherently anti-Semitic about the Hungarians. And that regime resonated with them. Now, then came the communist regime. Now, first of all, everybody was the target, the Jews as well as the non-Jews. The regime oppressed the whole of the population, but also the population was against it. And the regime had to be kept in place by fear, by a system, I write about this, of overlapping spy rings. Everybody was spying on everybody else, and everybody could be whispered about to be against the regime, and then retributions followed. It was not murderous in the volume of killing 600,000 people, but it was murderous enough and vindictive enough and unpopular entirely. So they were not communists, but my goodness, were they not anti-Semitic, and are they not now? That's my answer, I'm afraid.
Excellent. I have to ask this one last question. Your life is incredible, and what you went through and the lessons that you impart subtly and not so subtly in your book seems to me the ones that stick out. The importance of hard work, being happy with what you have, the importance of family, and telling the truth. Forgive me if I've missed it. Which one do you think, if you could say to this crowd, what is the most important guidance from your experience in your life that you would like these students here and at home to know?
Well, it's the opposite almost of what you said, being content with what you have. Not being content with what you have is what I would say is the guiding principle. It's always to strive for something better, for yourself and for those around you. I think that a value system which it discriminates between things that matter. What matters is loyalty, friendship, family. What matters is satisfaction in work and a striving for excellence. This is what I should like you to take.
Are there any questions from the audience? Like,
I wanted to ask if you found the communist...
Excuse me, please, speak up. I am very old and quite deaf. I'm 88 and 3/4 nearly years old. So, speak up, please.
Did you find that the communists were also anti-Semitic?
Also what?
were the communists also anti-Semitic?
The question implies that opinions could be expressed. In a communist regime, opinions cannot be expressed. Even anti-Semitism was pushed under. So strong was the oppression of the individual. You suspected, if you were a Jew, especially with a personal history like mine, you suspected everybody being anti-Semitic because you learned that lesson from preschool onwards. You suspected it. You had no evidence. There was no discussion of religion. There were, in the height of the regime, there was no religious activity for any religion, not only for Jewish. I am not sure that I was an undergraduate at that time, I am not sure that they all knew that I was Jewish. I was never asked. I would never have denied it, but nor did I advertise it, because it was not an issue. The individual's views, feelings, convictions, nothing. I don't know. But I suspect that anti-Semitism was just pushed under, it was there. Because the moment the revolution gave just a chink in the armory of the oppression, it buckled up. And it's there now.
Probably time for one.
Could you go into detail about being liberated by the Soviets?
Well, it was interesting militarily and humanly. We were being bombed throughout my time in those camps from on high by the British and the Americans. And you could see what happened in Vienna. The same thing happened with the armament factory in which I worked. There was no building left untouched, and they were very, very effective. But they were bombing from on high. Now, we were in a transit camp assembled when the Soviet army attacked the area. First of all, they came by low-flying aircraft, and they were machine gunning the people, objects, or almost hand bombing objects, targets. They thought that we were a military barracks, and they machine gunned into our barracks. We put up something white, trying to indicate that we were not combatants, and then but they came so near that you could see the very facial features of the air crew of the Soviets. Then they came marching in. Well, we realized that we were liberated. Those that were fit enough and well enough tried to embrace them, express joy. They liked the idea very much, and they took the women away into their camps, and they returned damaged. Thereafter, we knew that, especially at night, women had to be hidden from the Soviet army. They would give a piece of bread to children. They were interested in children, and they were also touched by old people. I describe in my book the way in which they took pity on my father. My father was 44 years old, but he weighed 35 kilograms. Now, I now weigh something like 50 or 52. imagine a man of your height. Well, he was one of those skeletons. And they took pity on him. And so it wasn't that they were heartless, but they were an occupying army. There were some very interesting aspects. If you had 3 or 4 of these very, very crude-looking and quite brutal Soviet army members together, they started singing beautiful songs in 3-part harmony. They had voices, they had musical inclinations, they had feelings, they had compassion, but they were an occupying army, and that's what it was like. If there was anything that we didn't have anything that they could take away from us, but anything like a watch, glasses, anything, they took away. There were words even. Zabrany is swiping away possessions from anybody. It was not unusual to see a Soviet soldier in the summertime with a sequence of wristwatches all the way up his arm. It was a different experience from being liberated by the British and the Americans. They also, as far as I'm concerned, totally ignored us. What I hear now from the Holocaust survivors was that people were taken from the camps into hospitals, into nursing homes, into camps, into Sweden or Canada, where they could be restored to some kind of human existence, having been liberated from those camps. We were not. We were totally ignored, other than what I already told you. Any questions? It was either boring or it was so comprehensive that there was nothing left to be asked.
Sammy, you have a question?
I just wanted to say thank you on behalf of all of us for your time today and for speaking. You spoke unfalteringly, and it was fascinating to hear your personal story intertwined with the historical story. I'm sure we would all only be further inspired when we are able to read your book. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.